Hi, my name is Angelina Vita, and I'm going to be giving my thesis presentation on my thesis topic, the critical period of first language acquisition in isolated situations. So that's a lot of really big words. I'll give a super fast explanation of what that is. When you're a child, or when you're born, you're going to learn like your mother tongue, which is going to be what you're talking because your parents talked it. So like I was born to American parents who spoke English, so I naturally picked up English, and that's become my first language. First language doesn't mean first language you like actually physically learn. So it's not going to be like I've learned English and now I'm trying to learn Spanish, which is not going well. But off topic, first language is going to be something that you picked up as a child and it just kind of built and grew and you didn't really think about learning. This topic turned into my thesis pretty slowly. I would say I picked this out when I was a teenager, maybe when I was a tween. Um, And it all started because of Tarzan. Anybody who's seen the show or read the book, you guys are going to know what I'm going to talk about. Basically, the story of Tarzan is about this little boy, or rather he's an infant, who's orphaned, his parents die, and he's actually picked up by a group of monkeys who raise him as their own. So it's like a super cute story, and he grows up in the wild, and he's swinging from trees, and he's having a really great time and everything. And then at some point, just around he becomes a man and everything, like late teenager, early 20s maybe, he ends up running to some other English people who know who he is and everything, and he's brought back to civilization. He learns how to speak English, he learns how to be an English gentleman, he learns he's extremely wealthy, and then he picks out somebody that he's going to fall in love with and marry and everything, and it's like a happy ever after, perfect little Disney story. As a child, I wasn't buying it, because all I could think is if I had been raised in the wild, in the forest, swinging from trees for a very long time, I think I would have a little bit of trouble coming back to civilization and learning how to use a fork and learning how to talk. So that's something that's important to note is monkeys don't necessarily have the ability to produce the same kind of language as we do. So even though they might be able to repeat words, and there are some studies of monkeys who could repeat like mom and dad, they didn't understand what it meant. So the idea that someone who was raised, poor Tarzan, someone who was raised in a situation without language was suddenly able to learn how to speak like an English gentleman and pick up his one true love and everything. I wasn't sold. Fast forward to my junior year, so last year in college, I had a project open in a linguistics course. Just, pick something you like about linguistics and write about it. And so I immediately wanted to write about why Tarzan was a lie, which was great, except I realized nobody actually knows why Tarzan is a lie. People know that there's a critical period and there's a time when children are not able to learn the language, but nobody knows what causes that. So that was a panic, but by the time I turned this into my thesis, I've kind of come up with my own hypothesis about that, and that's kind of where this whole presentation is going. The first hypothesis I want to talk about is not mine, but it's an accepted one in the linguistics field. It's called the critical period hypothesis. So basically, another bunch of big words, but that just means it's the idea that the human mind can learn a first language up to a certain age. So like from birth to 12 or 13 years old, that's the optimal time for you to pick up your first language. Once you turn 14, if you haven't had any experience with the English language, as an English-born baby, you're probably not going to speak English. If you haven't had any experience with the Spanish language, you're not going to speak Spanish. This critical period is just a time when your brain is at the optimal preparation to learn that first language. Once you hit a certain age, once you hit 12 or 13 years old, there is a marked noticeable difference. You're no longer able to learn that first language, and we actually don't have a lot of proof of anything otherwise. How we prove this critical period hypothesis? I say we, but I was not born this long ago. This was a while ago. This was back in the 1900s. Something happened called the forbidden experiment, and definitely not a good story. Basically, this situation went on to prove the critical period hypothesis, but it came at great cost. As you're probably thinking, to prove this kind of hypothesis, you would have to isolate a child and totally separate them from language and put them in a situation where they're not going to make up any kind of language themselves. And then, after they're like 14, then you see what's happened with their first language acquisition. So, definitely forbidden experiment, not something that anybody ethical would want to repeat. That being said, it was done, and not in a researcher situation, but in a severely abusive situation. A young girl named Jeannie Wiley was born to a father who was not a really great person. He kept her locked in a bedroom. She was tied to a potty chair. She was beaten for moving, beaten for talking. She had no experience with the human language because he was an absolutely nut person. And did not appreciate his daughter. She was rescued about around the age of 13 or 14. She looked like she was 8, so nobody really believed how old she was until they actually found out. Researchers immediately ran ahead with this because they saw her as someone they could use to prove whether or not the critical period actually exists. They got her through ethical means, but it's not like it necessarily was an ethical situation. Jeannie was cared for properly, and her researchers did try to help her, but they were really focused on figuring out the answer to this age-old question. Sadly, there was no answer. Jeannie could not learn a first language. At her age, 14, 15, it was not, she couldn't repeat that. She couldn't figure things out. So I give an example. They would give her an apple. What's this? Is this an apple? Very simple things. I want an A for apple, a long time ago. And she could never make that connection. So the syntactical connection between sentences and getting things and needing things and what words meant with objects were completely lost on her and never came back. So, unfortunately, there was, like I said, no progress made with her. And it kind of just went really downhill. Researchers ended up losing control of her. They were never able to continue studying her just because of the whole horrible situation. It went to the public, and media was really worried that she was being exploited and used just as unethically as her father had used her. So, that's as much as I know there. That means that we have actually no real information. We know that the critical period exists. We've had knowledge in it, but a few other cases with children who were isolated from language, not able to pick it up after a certain age. But there's no proof of what's causing this loss, which is where my hypothesis came in my title of this paper. I'm saying that it's the isolated situation that's causing a lot of this end for the first language acquisition. And I went through a series of studies to try to find this answer and make it something I felt I could stack my academic reputation on. The first study I went through was actually looking at chimpanzees. So right back to poor old Tarzan. I would say multiple studies. There's one in particular, just kind of trying to see how chimpanzees go about learning and everything. So this study took a wild-born mother. So this chimpanzee had been born in the wild. She had lived out in the trees and doing everything they do out there, and then she had been brought into captivity. Then they put several adult captive-born chimpanzees. So this would be monkeys or chimps who are they were born in a zoo or whatever. They were born in a controlled environment, and they weren't out there swinging in wild trees and running from lions and stuff. Then these two groups, this wild-born mother, captive-born adults, were put together with a 2-year-old captive-born male. So now they have a kid who's been born in captivity, but he's little and chill. The researchers gave the monkeys, the chimpanzees, bedding materials. So something that I find kind of fascinating and very relatable. Chimpanzees in the wild make beds every night because they want to sleep, they want to be comfortable, and if they're not getting that perfect amount of sleep and beauty sleep and everything, they're going to decline physically and mentally. Same. First of all, same. So that being said, researchers have been noticing that captive-born chimpanzees are not necessarily doing that anymore. Once they've been born in captivity and not been around wild exposure, wild bed building and everything, they're not making beds in captivity. They're just vibing on the couch or whatever. So by putting this wild-born mother together with these adult captive-borns and then adding this young little guy who was captive-born but still only a 2-year-old, the researchers are hoping to see can this 2-year-old learn from them? Can the adult learn from her? What's going to go on? Curiously enough, the adults did not learn, which is a critical period for the chimpanzees. The wild-born mother immediately ran off and started building her beds every night without fail. She'd make a beautiful, really sophisticated bed for herself to sleep in. Without fail, the captive-born 2-year-old, he'd sit down, he'd be watching it, he was so invested, and after a while, he started making his own bed too. And within a few years, he was making beds just as sophisticated as hers. Totally looked like he'd been out in the wild with her his whole life. The captive-born adults were a little bit disappointing. They didn't even watch the mother. Instead, they just went around doing this baking thing. It's called air bedding. So basically, they take all these bedding materials and just kind of throw them around, make piles of them, and then even make beds in the air. They were actually making beds, so air bedding, fake technique. At no point did they stop and hey, we should ask this wild-born mother, bro, how are you making your bed? They never thought about it, they never learned it, they never went to the stage where they realized that having a bed was going to make them sleep better. So, there's my first state. Okay, so there's a critical period in chimpanzees, and it's definitely affected by isolation. These wild-born adults are not being isolated from situations where they need build-a-beds, but the captive-born adults are isolated not only from that situation, but isolated from other wild-born adults who can teach them. So that's why the 2-year-old was able to learn. He was still young, still like there, ready to learn things and like be a college student and figure out how to make a bed. That brings me to the next study I looked at. Because chimpanzees, I didn't think I could necessarily, okay, here's something that happens with chimpanzees. Now I'm going to discuss what happened with Jeannie Wiley and any other child who's lost their first language. So I started looking at actually some infant physical stimulus studies. I can start by saying I don't really like kids. I'm probably not going to have kids. I'm not going to be around kids. I kind of avoid them because they snot a lot and it's not a thing for me. But that being said, I do know that physical contact between like a mother and a baby is super important. Anytime you're in sort of any like child development classes or anything like that, they're always talking about you need to massage them, you want to move their limbs around and everything, and make them feel loved, like hug them, kiss them, everything. So that physical touch is really important. I found several studies, but in particular one study that was super interesting. They took a group of 20 infants and separated them. So the first 10 infants were physically touched constantly, like they were touched, they were like hugged and everything, and this went on for about 10 days. So they had consistent, correct, proper physical touch. The other group of 10 infants were left alone. They were fed, of course, and they were washed and everything, but they weren't being touched or massaged or anything. At the end of this time frame, there was a huge difference between the two. There was actually a 47% greater weight gain between the infants who were physically touched and the ones who weren't. So already there's a huge difference. But even worse than that, the infants continued to be tested much later on, and researchers found that no matter what, the infants who had been physically stimulated were going to react much higher on neurological development tests than the infants who had not been physically stimulated during that short little 10-day period. So again, there's another proof isolation is definitely important. So that brought me up to my next section of studying, which was actually COVID. COVID is a big thing right now because it's kind of doing some damage. I actually just had it a couple months ago and it was not fun. I definitely do not recommend that. So I started thinking, well, if infants who are being isolated from physical touch are being affected by this, what about children who are isolated just from their peers? I have a cousin who's like 8, and he had like a whole year where he couldn't go to daycare because they're shut down due to COVID. So I was like, let's find some answers here, folks. So I found a study called the Resident Study, which has been going on since 2009. A bunch of researchers are just watching children, just like keeping track of them, seeing how they like developing and everything. Children born since pandemic era. So I've been saying like around March 2020. Children born since that era are showing a slight difference when it comes to neurological testing. Specifically, it's about two full standard deviations between the two groups. So children born before the pandemic era are scoring higher than children born during pandemic era. This is kind of people are questioning, is it because of the isolation? Children aren't going to schools, they're being kept home with quarantine. I know I was quarantined for 5 days and it was absolutely miserable. But these children are being kept, they're not making the same peer relationships, they're not having constant educator contact. So this isolation is possibly causing some back and forth issues. That being said, this is an ongoing study, so really we're not able to prove anything yet because it's still brand new and COVID is a continuing problem. So in a few years, I'll get back to you unless you know what's actually happening there. So now that I had a lot of proof that isolation is affecting the first language acquisition, I kind of said, well, does isolation affect the brain, period? And yes, of course isolation affects the brain, but it doesn't affect the language. I looked at some American prisoner of war, POWs who were kept in Vietnamese concentration camps during the Vietnam War. And these camps, I'm sure you've all heard so many terrible stories, like this monkey cages camp, which is where they would have cages underground actually, and soldiers would be kept in them. They were not able to move around, they were like super small. They would be kept underground, not talking to people, isolated for years. One guy, Floyd James Thompson, actually spent like 9 years in some of these camps, so he had constant isolation and constant abuse, similar to what Jeannie actually went through, being tied down, being physically injured, restricted from language, etc., etc. That being said, once Thompson was released and returned to America, he still had his English language. He still had his first language. He was able to talk with his family. It never disappeared. So that isolation is only affecting the critical period up to the age of 12 and 13. It's not like it's affecting 20, 30, 40-year-old men. In my opinion, this is kind of leaning towards, yeah, here is the critical period is being affected by isolation, and even though we can't necessarily repeat this forbidden experiment, I think we have a pretty good idea that maybe isolation has a really big hand in it. Speaking of forbidden experiment and repeating it, things did not go really well for Jean, and it's very heartbreaking to talk about, but actually researchers lost control of her. Like I said, it went to media, and people thought, what if researchers are using her as like a computer program? Like, what if they're making her do stuff, and they're not actually caring for her as a person, they're caring for her as an experiment? So the state took her and actually placed Jeannie into some foster care homes, which unfortunately didn't turn out great either. Jeannie was bounced between several different abusive homes, so when it rains, it pours sometimes. She ended up losing all the progress she had made. She had become a very affectionate, loving person, and it was completely destroyed by her situation with the foster homes. Eventually, the state intervened again, and she has now been placed in an undisclosed adult home somewhere in California. She's been there for a very long time. There was absolutely no information. They've done really well protecting her and keeping her private. So, as fascinating as this topic is, and like as much as I probably would go to graduate school and try to study it more, I don't think it gives us leeway to continue harassing people like Jeannie Wiley. I think it's sad to not know the answers and this kind of thing, but it's going to happen no matter what. And I feel that Jeannie Wiley's story is something that any researcher needs to keep in mind and just say this. If we're going to be researching this farther, and I know if I was to be researching this farther, we have to remember that this is going to be studying people, and no matter what we want to know, it doesn't give us license to create another forbidden experiment. Anyways, that's my hypothesis that the critical period is directly related to different isolation situations. If you guys want any more information, you're welcome to email me. I can send you my thesis or whatever. It's a pet topic of mine, so please talk to me about it. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much. Bye.